Dear colleagues, welcome to the opening ceremony of the SIEF2021, Breaking the Rules, Power, Participation, Transgression. My name is Ulla Savolainen and I work as a researcher here at the University of Helsinki. I am a member of the local organizing committee of this Congress and I will be moderating this ceremony. Just to let you know, we are recording this session. This opening ceremony will begin with a welcome address by the chair of the local organizing committee, Professor Hanna Snellman, a vice rector and a professor of European ethnology at the University of Helsinki. Please, Hanna Snellman, the screen is yours.
Dear colleagues, dear friends of European ethnology and folklore studies, and participants of SIEF Congress, willing to break rules, or at least willing to discuss scholarly topics related to breaking the rules. It is my particular pleasure to open this 15th SIEF Congress and warmly welcome you to the University of Helsinki. At our university, cooperation with global learned societies such as SIEF is something we value and cherish very highly, so I am most happy to welcome you all here. Little did I know when I, at the SIEF 2017 Congress in Göttingen, passed around Helsinki 2021 postcard, which I encourage you to keep and send back home once we met a few years later in Helsinki. Little did I know how history would go. It would now seem that life and the world has turned out somewhat differently. Now, even the act of sending a simple postcard from another country feels like a privilege, an extreme luxury, or danger when you think of the possible contamination. Due to restrictions caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, we had to make the difficult but necessary decision to organize this Congress online. Of course, it is a pity that right now we only have the chance to meet screen to screen, but on the other hand, thinking positively, SIEF will be among the forerunners in organizing large online scientific conferences. Doing so can help guide us towards a more environmentally and socially sustainable future where any scholar, early career or tenured professor in Finland or Fiji should be able to have access to scientific knowledge regardless of geographical location or financial situation. Let me take this opportunity of having you here to first say a few words about the University of Helsinki. The University of Helsinki is the oldest university in Finland and is my country's cultural and scientific cradle. Founded in 1640 by Queen Christina of Sweden, it has since educated 9 Finnish presidents, 4 Nobel Prize winners, and thousands of leaders in politics, science, culture, and economics. Now, University of Helsinki is an international scientific community of 40,000 students and faculty. We cover nearly every discipline under the midnight sun. The first folklore studies professorship in the world was established at the University of Helsinki already in 1908. European ethnology soon followed, and the first ethnology professorship was established exactly 100 years ago in 1921. Anthropology, for its part, has been taught at Helsinki since the beginning of the 20th century. Just recently, we have established permanent chairs in cultural heritage and indigenous studies. The SIEF 2021 Congress is a joint effort between multiple institutions and many people. SIEF has its board and scientific committee chaired by our wonderful SIEF President Nevena, and I have the honor of chairing the local committee, which consists of representatives from every Finnish university that teaches folklore studies, European ethnology, and anthropology, as well as representatives from learned societies and heritage organizations across Finland. The keynote speakers we have invited to this Congress also represent a wide spectrum of scientific fields. And they come from 3 continents, Africa, Europe, and North America. We have tried our best to give you some sense of being in Helsinki and in Finland, even though most likely you participate in this Congress from the comfort of your own home or office. You will get a touch of Helsinki via video clips and photographs showing what things look like here. You will be invited to visit a new permanent exhibition at our National Museum and also to experience the silences we in Finland so often enjoy and also tolerate so well. I truly encourage you to also take part in the musical program. It is unique and really gives you a taste of the Finnish and the Arctic. With these words, I wish you a very successful Congress and lots of interesting discussions in this exciting world of breaking the rules. I hope to see you soon in the activities that we together will be taking part in. Thank you and welcome. Tervetuloa in Finnish to SIEF 2021 Helsinki.
Thank you, Hanna Snellman. Next, we will hear a welcome address by the president of SIEF, Professor Nevena Škrbić-Alembijević, from the Department of Ethnology and Cultural Anthropology at the University of Zagreb. Please, Nevena Škrbić-Alembijević.
Dear SIEF colleagues, it is my great pleasure to greet you all at the opening of the 15th SIEF Congress in virtual Helsinki, with the theme Breaking the Rules, Power, Participation and Transgression. When we last enjoyed the atmosphere of SIEF togetherness at the Congress in Santiago de Compostela, few of us could imagine that we will experience our next gathering via HUA virtual platform. However, what many would see as an obstacle, our hosts from Finland saw as a challenge and opportunity. 6 Finnish universities, a national heritage institution, 2 learned societies and 4 foundations have joined forces to turn SIEF 2021 into a memorable event. Led by Hanna Snellman, they are determined to create a feel of Helsinki at the sensory and affective levels, by images, movements, sounds, and even by some baking at the very end of the Congress. Our hosts are celebrating the centenary of Finnish ethnology by, among other ways, organizing this Congress. I'm delighted to congratulate our Finnish colleagues on the 100th anniversary and wish them a lot of success in creating new forms of engagement for our disciplines. The Congress has all the potential to leave a strong mark on our fields. More than 1,200 delegates have registered, which shows that in times of international travel restrictions, we are still, or especially, dedicated to internationalization of our fields and to making our work even more meaningful and visible. The Congress program encompasses more than 200 sessions of panels, roundtables, and workshops organized in 18 different thematic streams, almost 800 papers and posters, a rich audiovisual program, experimental formats, presentations of journals, and so on. Also, it provides delegates with many networking opportunities through meetings of SIEF working groups, E&F journal editors, university department representatives, as well as hangouts where you can just chat and have a drink with your SIEF friends. So I'm sure we will all find our ways to get immersed in the Helsinki Congress. The organizing committee has decided to use the advantages of the online format to make some events and activities more accessible to those SIEF members who do not attend the Congress. That is the case with the General Assembly that will take place on Wednesday, and an invitation to the event has been sent to the whole SIEF membership list. SIEF also remains dedicated to fostering the inclusion of early career scholars in the work of our society. That is why, in the Congress program, you will find several workshops within the SIEF mentoring scheme, invitation to the Summer Schools reunion, and of course, SIEF Young Scholar Prize. You are all kindly invited to attend the lecture of this year's winner tomorrow. The ongoing coronavirus pandemic has made the production of rules that regulate our worlds and social interaction very visible. That adds more weight to the theme of the Congress, which focuses on the diverse ways of making, breaking, reinterpreting, and transgressing rules. Actually, while the scientific committee of the Congress was working on the call for panels, new rules were established, which added an extra layer to our understanding of what is at stake when rules are imposed, transgressed, or broken in everyday life. That turned the defining of the theme into an ongoing dialogue with social realities and a constant reflection of our own positions and roles in the making and breaking of rules. That process led us also to questions about the boundaries of our disciplines, to the issues of power, participation, and courses of action we take as researchers, as well as responsible and engaged citizens. I'm certain that the Congress will raise fruitful discussions on those and many other topics. I will close my speech by wishing the Congress and all of you every success. Thank you.
Thank you, Nevena. Next, we will hear a welcome address of Seurasaari Foundation by the Foundation's board member, Dr. Tytti Stiel, postdoctoral researcher at the University of Helsinki. Please, Tytti Stiel, the screen is yours.
Dear conference delegates, organizers and the SIEF board, on behalf of the Seurasaari Foundation, I have the great pleasure of welcoming you to the 2021 SIEF conference in Helsinki. The Seurasaari Foundation was established by ethnologists. The purpose of the Seurasaari Foundation is to support Seurasaari Open Air Museum. The foundation does this by means of supporting ethnological research and publishing, studying Finnish folk art and making it more widely known, and organizing folklore performances and presentations on popular culture. The best known event is the Seurasaari Midsummer Bonfires, organized since 1954. The event was a big hit from the beginning, since when it has received more than 600,000 visitors. We hope you can join the party another year. Seurasaari Foundation supports ethnological research by awarding grants to students and researchers. This was made possible by Eino and Lempi Hietanen, who willed their life savings to the foundation. Eino, a sailor, and Lempi, a cook, enjoyed visiting Seurasaari very much and wanted to support cultural heritage and research. So far, the Emil and Lempi Hietanen Fund has awarded 208 ethnologists with a total of more than 400,000 euros. The Seurasaari Foundation would like to congratulate the organizers and the SIEF board for choosing an excellent theme for the conference. Making and breaking the rules has been at the core of everyday life during the pandemic. At the same time, it carries timeless relevance to many themes in ethnology and folklore studies. We would like to thank the organizers and wish all delegates a fruitful and inspiring conference.
Thank you, Tytti. Next in this ceremony, we will have the pleasure to hear a runo singing performance by Iki Turso. Iki Turso is a performance group experimenting with sonic theater and runo singing derived from oral tradition. Iki Turso was established in 1999. At that time, Professor of Ethnomusicology and musician Heikki Laitinen assembled a group of musicians attuned to sung poetry and improvisation to dive into traditional singing cultures. One of the group's core forms of expression is sonic improvisation, which aims both to diversify and develop expressions of the human voice and to encourage musicians to develop themselves as holistic performers. Please, Iki Turso.
Lystikki lylyjen seppä, lylyjen seppä, lystikki lylyjen seppä. Kaunis kauppi köyrötyinen, köyrötyinen, kaunis kauppi köyrötyinen. Sykysyn lylyjä laati, lylyjä laati, sykysyn lylyjä laati. Ketti kalhuja keväähän, ja keväähän ketti kalhuja keväähän. Lykkäsi lylyn lumelle, lykkäsi lylyn lumelle. Ku on voina vuolakkeena, ku on voina vuolakkeena. Päätyypä hiiet kuulomassa, päätyypä hiiet kuulomassa. Hiiet hirviä rakenti, hiiet hirviä rakenti. Hiiet neuvo hirviänsä, hiiet neuvo hirviänsä. Kukunki sukimoansa, kukunki sukimoansa. Nyt sie juokse hien hirvi, nyt sie juokse hien hirvi. Juoksipa siitä se hien hirvi, juoksipa siitä se hien hirvi. Lapin lastuu tanterille, Lapin lastuu tanterille. Potkasi koasta korvan, potkasi koasta korvan. Selät keitin keikahutti, selät keitin keikahutti. Liemet lietehen levitti, liemet lietehen levitti. Lapin koirat haukutteli, Lapin koirat haukutteli. Lapin lapset itketteli, Lapin lapset itketteli. Lapin naiset nakratteli, Lapin naiset nakratteli.
kuun tykönä päivän.
Karhut rautakahlehissa, karhut rautakahlehissa, suet pantu suitsi suuhun, suet pantu suitsi suuhun. Voi minä puoluinen poika, miten olla kun juineleä tällä inhulla iällä. Karhu rautakahlehissa, suet pantu suitsi suuhun.
Sevotti uutta kuuta, lylyliukasta lipuhvaa. Janhus hankea ja lovaa, niin kuin neito nuorta miestä. Alla aamuna varahin, aivoin aika huomenessa. Käin lylyn luumelle, uuden suksen suijahutin. Lähden nyt kultaa kulkemaan, oidailolle kulkemaan, rahan armas astumaan, oidailolle astumaan, kullaista kujaa myöten, oidailo kujaa myöten, hopiaista tietä myöten, oidailolle tietä myöten. Ei tästä etäviä, oidailo etäviä, vien bändihin väelle, oidailolle ja väelle, vetäjäisen pellon päähän, oidailolle pellon päähän, paamen puuhun puhtaaseen, oidailolle puhtaaseen, honkahan hyvähän puuhun, oidailo hyvähän puuhun, vetäjään kaunoiseen, oidailolle kaunoiseen. Tuolla tuuli tuvittelee, oidailolle tuvittelee, ilman henki heiluttavi, oidailolle heiluttavi. Tuonne heitän heijoseni, oidailolle heijoseni, heitän mieli tiettäväni, oidailolle omahan päiveätä hyämähän oidailota hyämähän.
Thank you, Iki Turso. Next, the program will continue with the keynote lecture by Professor Catherine Borland. Now, I would like to ask you to go back to Huva and join the keynote session there. So, see you all.
So we'll just wait a couple of moments for people to maybe just move session inside Hoover, those who are moving there.
Okay, good.
So Nomad team, can I ask a question while we're waiting? So when it's time.
It is my great joy and honor to welcome you to listen to the first keynote lecture at the SIEF Conference 2021, Breaking the Rules, Power, Participation, Transgression. The keynote will be given by Catherine or Katie Borland. Katie, you are warmly welcome. I am Lotte Tarkka and I work as professor here in Helsinki. And my partner here in this moderation is Erika Koskinen-Koivisto. Erika. Erika is not here, is it? Yeah, there, sorry. But she's muted. Rowan, could you please?
Yeah, she's not muted, but I can't hear you, Erika, like we could before.
How about now?
Yep, yeah. Perfect.
Yes. So I'm Erika Koskinen-Koivisto, researcher at the University of Jyväskylä, and I'm also a former student of Dr. Borland.
And we will guide you through this first keynote, supported by the technical staff from Nomad IT, Rowan and Rini, and it's essential, as you could already see. Katie Borland is Associate Professor of Comparative Studies in the Humanities at Ohio State University and the Director of the Center for Folklore Studies. She completed her PhD thesis in folklore at Indiana University in 1994, and her thesis was on the politics of festival in revolutionary Nicaragua. In her own words, Katie is dedicated to teaching the artfulness of ordinary life and the ways in which traditional expressive arenas constitute contested terrain. In practice, this has meant the study of phenomena like narrative, dance, performance, family folklore, volunteer work, environmentalism, and immigration, and often but not always in the context of Latin America. Her books include Unmasking Class, Gender, and Sexuality in Nicaraguan Festival from 2006 and Creating Community, Hispanic Migration to Rural Delaware from 2001. And the latest co-edited book from this year, Performing Environmentalisms, Expressive Culture and Ecological Change. And a major work in progress is a monograph with a working title, Tales of Self and Others, the intersubjective poetics of oral narrative. It already became evident that Katie is dedicated to teaching. She specializes in experiential education that emphasizes engaged student learning through direct experience and reflection. She is a multiply awarded teacher and advisor. The last of these awards is from this year, the Siddons Award for Distinguished Graduate Student Advising at Ohio State. And then some testimonies on Katie as a teacher. One of her international posts has been the Fulbright Bicentennial Chair of American Studies here in Helsinki. Katie had a class on performance studies, and the students learned in practice that to study performance needs ability and receptivity to performance. And that is why Katie and the students did together some performance, pedagogically inspired by contact improvisation, Augusto Boal, and the tactics of political protest. For many quite restricted Finnish students, this was a transformative experience. One way of breaking the unspoken rules of teacher-student communication and proxemics. And Erika, you have some memories too.
Yes, during my doctoral studies, I spent a year as a ASLA Fulbright grantee at the Center for Folklore Studies at the Ohio State University, USA. One of the main reasons why I chose to apply for Fulbright, particularly at the Ohio State University, was Dr. Boland's research, especially her famous article, That's Not What I Said, Interpretive Conflict in Oral Narrative Research, in the volume Beyond Women's Words. And I was happy and honored to meet Dr. Boland, or Katie, as I later came to know her. Katie kindly advised me during my Fulbright year and generously introduced me to many of her colleagues. Later, when I returned to Finland to complete my PhD degree, Katie and I did teaching collaboration, connecting our classrooms via video conference, the technology at the time, which allowed our students to discuss together the world of folklore, and especially the Finnish national epic, the Kalevala.
Thank you, Erika. And today, Katie will give us a talk on slow activism, lessons from citizen scientists. And this talk is pre-recorded, but we will return later to this live mode in Zoom, and you can stay right in this same webinar. And we will start the discussion in roughly an hour. But Katie, the screen is yours, and you're welcome to say some words before the pre-recorded lecture. Katie.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, terrific. Well, thank you so much. It's such an honor to be the opening speaker for this wonderful experimental Breaking the Rules conference. And I just hope that the presentation will provide us with the kind of food for thought that you had hoped for. I'm truly, truly honored. Of course, I was disappointed not to have been able to travel to Helsinki, particularly in this most pleasant time of the year up north. But I think we'll try to focus in the best way we can on the advantages of the broader participation that a virtual conference allows. I am greeting you from my porch in Clintonville in Columbus, Ohio, the ancestral territory of the Shawnee, Delaware, Miami, Ottawa, and Wyandot. And I want to give a special thanks to Erika for being such a wonderful ambassador and host over all these years. She has really been the glue that has made it possible for me to be connected with the larger community of folklorists and ethnologists in Finland. So thank you, Erika, for that. Lotta mentioned my special interest in cultural contestation, and I just wanted to signal today that I'm focusing more on cooperation as a form of activism. And of course, in every situation, there are ways in which people differ, and there are ways in which they share many things in common. In this increasingly politically polarized climate, particularly in the United States, I am somewhat surprising to myself, more attracted to the latter, the possibilities for cooperation. I also wanted to say a word about the format. I don't know, for those of you who are invisible to me, but I have always found it difficult to follow theoretical presentations orally. And I think that Zoom has made that difficulty even stronger. So what I will be presenting today is more the story of a project within a project. And I'm hoping that we can together theorize afterwards in discussion about whether this constitutes activism, and if so, in what ways. I personally find it much more exciting and productive to exchange ideas together in conversation and in dialogue. So I do hope that in spite of Zoom, we will be able to talk together. I also wanted to mention that this notion of slow activism is something I've been developing in conversation with my graduate student advisee, soon to be PhD. She's defending in July, Jordan Lovejoy, and particularly in the context of environmental politics in Appalachia. So Jordan, if you are out there, I hope you will weigh in during discussion. And finally, because the issue of representation is so fraught for Appalachian people, I've tried my best to make space for their voices in this presentation. As many of you know, a great deal of the meaning in statements comes from the vocal qualities of the speaker. And since technology now allows this, we will hear from some of the local actors that I have been engaged with. Ed, and one final note, please excuse the errors in the transcriptions. In the work of trying to put together a pre-recorded presentation, that was one of the details that we didn't quite get to. So that they are there, but you'll notice there might be a little bit of difference between what people are saying and what is on the screen. And with that, I'll turn it over to the conference IT. If you could play the recording. At the grand opening of the Gladys Riley Golden Star Lily Nature Preserve in May 2017, a crowd of volunteers from the Friends of Scioto Brush Creek and the Arc of Appalachia joined the families of those who had once owned the two farms just south of the village of Otway. Some family members had come from as far away as Massachusetts for the dedication. One still lived down the road. After a welcome from ARC founding director Nancy Stranahan, who had negotiated the sale, Martin McAllister addressed the crowd.
If a person is lucky in their life, they're touched by some really special people, and you can usually count those people on probably one hand. And mine was touched by a couple of people on each end of my education life. One as a first grader. Gladys Riley was my first grade teacher. She taught for over 50 years. And I know there's a lot of local people here. Who had Gladys as a teacher? I know some hands are going up. Yeah. So right over here in Otway School, and even though she was a classroom teacher, she really tried to show us a lot about nature. I have a lot of really vivid memories. Like, even though I was only 6, I distinctly remember the first time I ever saw evening grosbeaks. And it was a snowy day, and they were across Route 73 in the neighbor's lawn, and she got all the kids out of their seats so we could come to the window and look down across the road and see evening grosbeaks. And oddly enough, the last time I ever saw Gladys was another bird story. She called me at home. I was trying to think how old I was. I was an adult. I was out working, but she called and said, "Have you ever seen a Cape May warbler?" And I said, "No." And she said, "There's one right outside my living room window right now. Why don't you come down and see it?" So I drove 6 miles to her house. The bird was still there. We sat in her living room and we watched this Cape May warbler. So really special lady. But she touched my life in regards to nature, and so did Dave Todd, who's back there. He's on the board of the Arc of Appalachia, and those two people sort of guided me toward a career in natural resources. And one of the things that Jody, my wife, and I have been able to do is work with a handful of people to create a group called the Friends of Scioto Brush Creek. We started about 19 years ago doing good things for the stream, trying to pick up trash and clean up highways and do educational programs for children. And here we are 19 years later. The group has over 200 members, and we've ran how many school children through our day program? 2,000, something like that. So pretty exciting that we've been able to be part of that, and it really goes back to people like Gladys Riley that got us interested in nature. So I hope you enjoy this place.
For 23 years now, Martin and Jody have worked to broaden the appreciation for nature in southeastern Ohio. This work proceeds on the assumption that ordinary people can organize themselves into networks to achieve a particular set of goals without giving up important differences of education, of experience, of values. Their strategy, however, doesn't involve breaking the rules. Instead, they have managed to deepen and widen an incipient local environmental consciousness through a process of slow activism that relies on both science and storytelling. Like many other citizen science initiatives, the Friends of Scioto Brush Creek ask us to think like a watershed and to look to local actors for sustained community transformation. In their recently published dialogue, Maribel Alvarez and Gary Navan discuss the various ways that a citizen science, citizen folklore model can disrupt existing hierarchies of knowledge. Alvarez points out, quote, "People have a way of responding creatively to the circumstances they face. That is the bottom line of citizen folklore and citizen science, a fundamental appreciation that people observe their surroundings, interact with other species, negotiate changes in their environments, and adapt to variable circumstances, and that in doing all these practical living routines, they accumulate bodies of knowledge that scientists and folklorists living outside those same predicaments may easily miss." My colleagues and our students were certainly outsiders when we began our 5+ year collaborative ethnography of placemaking in southeastern Ohio. Knowing that this area, like the larger Appalachian region, suffers from stereotypes of social backwardness, economic stagnation, and cultural and political conservatism, we focused less on specific research outcomes and more on developing broad and varied relationships with individuals and groups currently living and working in Scioto County. Black and white, young and old, town dwellers and forest dwellers, old-timers and newcomers. To keep our inquiry open, we developed a broad question that accommodates varied and shifting partners' goals on the one hand, but, important to us, addresses the negative stereotype of the region as a stagnating, diseased, and emptied-out rural space. An anonymous donor allowed us a rare opportunity to develop the project in an open-ended manner over time. We established a series of field schools that provided team-based ethnographic training to our students as they documented the activities, collections, or projects that our community partners considered important. Anchoring our work in the folklore archives allowed successive groups of students to build on the work of previous groups and faculty and staff to follow up on student leads in addition to providing them with contacts to pursue. And so this is really a discovery process all the way through, and anyone on the team could shift, in a sense, the focus of the research. Collaborative ethnography shares some characteristics with decolonizing methodologies in its focus on working with community partners to develop the research goals, co-conducting the research, and reviewing any research products together. Nevertheless, decolonizing has a specific thrust that is not appropriate here. In fact, the group whose lives our team has been documenting represent, for the most part, descendants of settler colonialists who arrived in the late 1700s in what was then the Northwest Territory. Those early settlers proceeded to terrorize and violently dispossess indigenous residents of their towns and forests, principally the Shawnee. Many current residents can point to a deep, multi-generational attachment to place. Nevertheless, we cannot conflate their understandings and experiences with indigenous ways of knowing. My focus will be on how some in this community are building a powerful narrative of the special nature of nature in this somewhat overlooked place in order to encourage local stewardship. Our work with the Friends of Scioto Brush Creek began when my colleague Cassie Patterson and I met Martin and Jody at a festival on an exploratory trip to the region in 2016. Several months later, we returned to formally interview them and discuss the possibility of developing a documentation project. At that second meeting, Martin and Jody felt that they would benefit from learning more about why their own members had joined the watershed group. They gave us contacts for 5 families who owned land adjacent to the creek. 2 of our students then spent a week visiting with and interviewing these members. At our initial meeting, Dr. Patterson and I were curious to know why Jody and Martin had taken the particular step of forming a watershed group. They explained that the Friends began as a subcommittee of the Shawnee Nature Club, which met at the lodge in Shawnee State Park. We later learned that watershed groups had proliferated across Ohio in the late 1990s and early 2000s, suggesting to us that some state organization, the Ohio Environmental Protection Agency perhaps, had promoted the idea. Recognizing a strong local antipathy to perceived government overreach, the Friends' founding members intentionally opted not to pursue a scenic river designation, which is one avenue for protecting a waterway. Instead, they designed an educational program that would remind residents of the treasures in their own backyard. Indeed, Scioto Brush Creek supports several rare species of freshwater mussels and fish, as well as the charismatic eastern hellbender, a giant salamander. Here's how Martin describes it. And can you tell us, I know you told us the first time we met about this, but why is it that this particular creek has managed to remain pretty uncontaminated?
Yeah. This is just my hypothesis. Where it's located is right on the edge of the unglaciated Appalachian Plateau. It's on the western front of the plateau, which means it's too far east and too hilly and rugged to be great farmland. You know, the only place you can farm around here are in the creek bottoms and the ridge tops because all the hillsides are too steep. And they're too steep for development, so they're mostly forested. And forests are really good for creeks. And it's too far west, it's on the edge of the escarpment, so it's too far west for it to have coal and natural gas. So there's no energy development here. So there's really little development pressure. You can't farm, you can't drill for oil, you can't drill for gas, you can't frack. The only thing that you can extract here is timber and stone. And that's what they've been extracting for 150 years, timber and stone. But they've been doing it in a relatively sustainable way. So it hasn't had a huge impact on the stream. So that, combined with the fact that since there's no industry here, not many people live here, not much of the forest has been cleared. And if you want healthy streams, you have to have forests. And 81% of this watershed is still forested. That's amazing. 81% of 270,000 acres is still forested. Some of that thanks to ODNR because it's designated state forest. Shawnee State Forest and Brush Creek State Forest both overlap into the watershed. So, you know, if you go east of here, you got acid mine drainage. I think we talked about that earlier.
Right.
And if you go west of here, you got heavy sedimentation because of plowing for crops.
So lucky happenstance.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so what our group said was, let's not wait another 50 years until some kind of pressure has degraded the stream. Wouldn't it be better if we spent a little bit of money and time now keeping it clean, as opposed to doing what they had to do on the Little Miami, which is spend a lot of time and effort to try to, clean it up. So that's really our goal. For instance, if you look at all the species that live in this creek that have ever been discovered since it was first studied, and they first started studying it around 1900, so over 100 years of fish collections and records, there have only been 2 species lost. 2 out of 84. So as far as its fish fauna, this stream is more intact probably than any in the state. It's just unbelievable. In fact, I think I just read that maybe there was a record for one of those species found again. So I need to confirm that, but one of them may be back.
Wow.
Yeah.
Impressive.
It's like our own little Grand Canyon right here. It's pretty special. Most people don't recognize it.
And I want to stop here and briefly gloss Martin's reference to the Grand Canyon. So for those of you who are not familiar with the United States, you've probably heard of this place, and it's way out west somewhere. But several states on the East Coast claim to also have Grand Canyons. And although there are no canyons in Scioto County, Martin is making the claim that nature exists everywhere and wild places exist not only in the West, but also in the eastern United States. In spite of its high biodiversity, though, creek health is compromised by 3 potential sources of pollution: sewage leaks from faulty septic systems, erosion where trees have been removed from the creek banks either for farming or lawns, and illegal dumping. Martin emphasizes that the first of these is largely a problem of poverty, and it's neither practical nor moral to insist that people fix their septic systems if you can't also help them with the cost of repairs. Jody explained that rural county health departments are stretched thin. They won't inspect private septic systems unless they receive a complaint. The Friends partnered with Northwest School District to offer a full-day hands-on Creek Day each September for every 6th grader in the district. The village of Otway has preserved a covered bridge that crosses the Scioto Brush Creek about halfway along its 60-mile course. A small park with a covered picnic area encircles the bridge. It's an ideal spot to launch a hands-on science program. The children put on waders, take water samples, collect macroinvertebrates from under the rocks, and shock, count, and identify fish. Over the years, Creek Day programming has grown to 6 stations, including a food chain game and an exercise in which children use anti-erosion principles to design their own creekside homes. Jody explains the overall philosophy of the program.
So in a couple of our educational programs, we've actually borrowed some of the examples of them from Ohio State's Museum of Biological Diversity, so the kids can actually see what we're talking about. And they can look at it and they can think, wow, this lives in the stream, and make them aware of some of these things that are in there. And then encourage them to use the stream in a positive way, the recreational activities that are there that they can use that will not impact the stream negatively. We try to encourage them to do that, bring their family with them, use that stream as much as they can. Teach them about the food chains and why what they do impacts the stream, teaching them that every time a piece of litter is thrown down, what is the watershed? Everybody that lives in this area is part of that watershed, and everything that gets thrown down will go into a teeny little stream, goes into a little bit bigger one until eventually it goes into the creek. So what they do every single day of their life is actually impacting the Scioto Brush Creek. And if they want to continue to have this resource or this recreational activity, this place to fish, whatever it is they do, swim, then they need to take ownership of it and start being a part of the solution to those major top 3 threats that we talked about earlier that are there for the stream. And so the kids get that. They get that. And then we always encourage them to take one piece of that knowledge back to their family. Martin always asks at the end of the program if you'll do one thing, and that is go back and tell somebody in your family, your neighbor, your grandma, your grandpa, whoever, and share with them one thing that you learned today about the stream that you didn't know. And so hopefully that's disseminating that information to the families, and then we again start to see them coming back and using the stream.
Get people into the creek, not just the kids on a school outing, but parents and grandparents too. This visceral experience, Jody believes, will make them better stewards of their environment. Martin and Jody and other local naturalists champion the unusual diversity of the mixed mesophytic forest, which is characterized by over 70 different tree species, and its ability to support numerous rare and endangered species. By 2017, the Friends had become well enough established that the power company donated 300 acres along the creek to the group as part of an arrangement to mitigate construction happening elsewhere. The Friends actively manage this land to encourage prairie restoration and riparian corridors, which entails mowing, planting, and removal of the so-called invasive species, all on a volunteer basis. They also maintain the newly established preserve outside Otway, named after Gladys Riley. Most recently, they received a grant to construct a gravel pathway under a highway bridge in order to connect the Otway Community Park on one side of the highway to the covered bridge on the other. All these transformations provide increased public access, not only to the Scioto Brush Creek, but to some of the forests and fields that border it. They describe their work as building on a long legacy of naturalist research and activism, epitomized by another woman teacher and researcher, E. Lucy Brown. Over a career that spanned the first half of the 20th century, this botanist professor, her entomologist sister, Annette, and a cohort of University of Cincinnati graduate students meticulously cataloged and described the trees, plants, and especially wildflowers that occupy this region. In 1924, Brown founded the Cincinnati chapter of the Wildflower Preservation Society. In her larger work on woodlands of the eastern United States, Brown theorized that during successive ice ages, the steep, narrow valleys of the Appalachian region offered protective warmth to forest plants that elsewhere went extinct. Throughout her career, Brown lobbied tirelessly for nature preserves and ultimately succeeded in saving a 22-acre limestone prairie in nearby Adams County. That campaign led to the purchase of the 13,000-acre Edge of Appalachia Preserve, not to be confused with the Arc of Appalachia Preserves, another group of preserves in the area, and to the creation of the Nature Conservancy, the largest environmental nonprofit supported by U.S. membership. By telling and retelling this story, the story of E. Lucy Brown, the Friends offer an alternative narrative to that of industrial abandonment. All this emphasis on rare plants and animals, however, ignores the historical and changing nature of the existing landscape. Martin admits,
if you look at any photos of the forests around southern Ohio in like the late 1800s and early 1900s, it looks like a nuclear bomb went off. They're horrible. They were just abused, stripped, the soil washed away. It was terrible.
Indeed, by the early 1900s, the forests that had once covered 95% of Ohio had been almost entirely cut down. In southeastern Ohio, the wood had been harvested to fuel numerous small iron furnaces. In 1916, realizing that the state had lost both its source of lumber and the wildlife the forests had once supported, Ohio legislators began establishing state parks and forests. With 5,000 acres purchased in 1922, the Theodore Roosevelt State Game Preserve was one of the earliest and largest of these newly public lands. It later became Shawnee State Park and was substantially improved during the Great Depression by civilian Conservation Corps teams. The Ohio Division of Natural Resources, established in 1949, bought thousands of additional acres of wasteland around the park. As a consequence of this reforestation, white-tailed deer, beaver, and in the last 10 years, bobcats have returned to the area. Rural Ohio is characterized neither by vast swaths of public land, as in the western states, nor by vast private holdings by non-local corporations, as is true of the forests of Maine, for example. Instead, numerous private smallholders have cultivated forest land. With public land ownership in the state a mere 4.2% of the total, and that puts us way down on the list of states in comparison to over 90% of Alaska being public land. Clearly, the reforesting story that ODNR likes to tell, centered on forward-thinking state legislators, needs to be amended to include other actors. As Justine Law and Kendra McSweeney argue, the prevailing government doctrine regarding reforestation regards rural smallholders not as partners, but as pesky holdovers from an earlier era who cannot be trusted to properly steward their land. And yet, these smallholders have played a significant role in Ohio's forest recovery. As local environmentalists, Martin and Jody have developed a different attitude toward their neighbors, one that sees them as partners in the cultivation of forests and the protection of streams. Indeed, the folks living in and around the returning forest have engaged in fractionated livelihoods, as Catherine Roberts terms the combination of wage labor, farming, trading, and resource extraction required of those who stay put across most of the Appalachian region. And there is also a tremendous outmigration from this area because of the lack of jobs and other conditions, and also a tremendous pull. So often people will spend their working lives outside of the area and then return to retire in their family homes. Interesting combination. But those who stay put engage in fractionated livelihoods. Rust Belt decline began as early as the 1960s in the nearby city of Portsmouth. The stores and businesses that once dotted the main streets of Raritan, Otway, and McDermott gradually shuttered as local economies foundered. By the mid-1990s, Otway's local school had shut down, and the children were bused to the consolidated Northwest schools outside McDermott. Today, a motorist driving through Otway would find only the depot, a gas station that doubles as a pizza parlor, and a dollar store that is struggling to keep its doors open. 66 or 67 homes constitute the village, housing perhaps 150 people. In many ways, Otway epitomizes the plight of small towns and villages across the southeast Ohio region. Framed photos of more prosperous times, when local timber was harvested for railroad ties, line the walls of the eponymous gas station. Over the years, our research teams have slowly made our way into the homes and meeting spaces of folks living in the watershed to learn more about how voluntary stewardship works. In March 2017, 2 field school students visited 3 Creekside property owners, a couple of retired psychotherapists, a high schooler and her parents, and a couple of retired farmers, as well as staff at the Northwest Middle School. Student impressions, as reflected in their field notes, underscore the diversity of perspectives and experiences of those who support the Friends. One contradiction that troubled them was the way that people spoke about the culture of the region. Teachers and the mayor of Otway described an egalitarian ethos born of widespread poverty. In other words, everyone's the same. Nobody has any money. Yet some of the wealthier volunteers who were involved with the Friends disparaged their neighbors as hyper-conformist and risk-averse, while others addressed this difference in a more hesitant, less pejorative register. Here's how the father of a high schooler who is very active in the Friends described it.
How about like change in demographics or population or just people, culture, anything like that?
Don't see a whole lot of change in that in this area. It's been, I don't want to say a closed area, but it's an Appalachian area, and it's still, there's no work in this area, so you don't get an influx of people like you do into the cities. You know, so it's still pretty laid back. It's the word, cliquish.
All agreed, however, that the creek, as well as the surrounding area, is much cleaner than it was in the 1970s when the Portsmouth steel mill painted the sky red. Still, they all shared fond childhood memories of swimming in the creek during the summer and skating in the winter when it used to freeze over. The student ethnographer's most rewarding interview was at the home of the retired farmer couple who typified the fractionated livelihoods of Otway area residents. They had raised turkeys until the market dried up in the 1980s, then tobacco for 30 years. The husband drove a school bus, the wife sold produce from her home garden, and they say that pretty much paid their bills. Here's the wife's appreciation of Scioto Brush Creek.
We have a little run, Thompson's Run, that runs into Scioto Brush Creek, so we use that as water for the greenhouse. So we haven't had to use the Scioto Brush Creek. But yeah, we always knew it was there, and I always liked taking a walk down to it in the mornings. I'll walk down there just to see the birds, or sometimes there's different birds. There's muskrats or
beavers,
just different animals down there. I enjoy looking at going down, visiting it.
This farmer quietly voices an affective attachment to the creek above and beyond its use to her as a water source for her greenhouse. As she continues, however, she surfaces a countervailing threat to the story of an improved and recuperated watershed.
And the wildflowers. I always thought this area used to have a lot of wildflowers. And we'd just go looking up the hill there, looking at the wildflowers. Back up the run, we'd always see a lot of wildflowers.
Has that changed?
Yeah.
There aren't as many?
Trilliums are not as plentiful as they used to be. Because that's what we had, a lot of trilliums, but the Virginia bluebells, I think, are thicker than, I don't remember when I was a kid seeing them along Brush Creek.
Poppies, hepaticas, and the little iris there, you don't hardly see them anymore. They cut all that back there. Yeah, after they log, it doesn't come back for years and years.
Who owns that land?
The state does now, but before they owned it, it got logged, and so then they
it was clear cut.
So there was a lot of flowers back up in there. We used to go when I was a kid.
In interviews other students and I had with older residents of the area, wildflowers came up again and again as an aspect of the environment that people value. The retired postmaster of Friendship, Ohio, a little town at the southern base of Shawnee State Park, reminisced about driving through the state forest each spring with his wife to locate and appreciate patches of woodflowers that clear-cutting has since destroyed. And a retired copy repairman from Portsmouth told me that he had discovered a parcel marked for clear-cutting in the state forest when hunting for a rare wildflower. Perhaps this concern for flowers derives from E. Lucy Brown's influence, her narrative of the area's special value. To notice flowers, where and when they come up, and where and when they have disappeared, implies an intimate attachment to one's local environment and a special way of walking or driving in the woods. The 2017 student ethnographers interviewed more militant members of another offshoot of the Shawnee Nature Club, Save Our Shawnee Forest, or SOS. That group was lobbying to stop a 20-year program of extensive clear-cutting in the state forests that had been brought on by a combination of natural crises, an ice storm in 2003 and a fire in 2009, both of which weakened the timber stock, and shrinking state allocations to the Department of Forestry, which some argued was pressuring them to harvest more timber to make their budget whole.
How do you feel about the clear cutting? Because I heard about that.
I don't like it.
You know, private property or Meade property, I don't know if that's too much of our business, but state property I don't think should be clear cut.
Yeah.
And they're cutting a lot of it.
You know, it's sad.
Southern Ohio, I don't know the
I don't
other
like it.
areas of the state, but I'm sure around Chillicothe, the forest there has been cut hard, and Shawnee Forest is really cut hard.
Do you think there's a lot of people around here against it?
I'd say probably half and half.
We just keep our mouth shut though, because that's state, so
Well, it's logging, but
yeah, some people make their living that way, and just like we made living raising tobacco, but a lot of people were against that too. It just depends on everybody's different.
yeah, it won't affect the state of Ohio that much because they'll be around in 200 years. You know where that's going to be here a lifetime, and where they've cut in Shawnee Forest and Brush Creek Forest. You know, we're never going to sit growing. But the hillsides here were cut in the 80s, early 80s. And they're growing back up different kind of wood than what was there. Mostly softwoods come back.
And a lot of brush, brambles.
The couple encapsulate a great deal in this brief exchange. They tell us that the state operates in ways beyond their control. Martin and Jody would agree. They have tried to interest state-level representatives in their work, and while they have had good success locally with township representatives, they've gotten no response from legislators. Though Scioto Brush Creek has not been directly affected by the clear cutting, many of the older residents we interviewed echoed the farmer's lament that he will not live to see the forest restored. From these smallholders' perspective, the state is no longer working as the engine of forest return. Instead, longtime residents are the ones looking out for the beaver and muskrats, the trillium, and the petticoats. In 2018, I was able to search for broader signs of environmental stewardship in the watershed, while a new group of student ethnographers were engaged in service projects with other groups. I contacted Denise Rose, Mayor of Otway, to learn more about how the Friends are viewed by local leaders, and Denise introduced me to a logger father and son so that I could get their perspective on the clear-cutting controversy. The younger logger owns the depot, where Denise works as a cashier, and he serves as pastor of her church. Although he prefaced his remarks by saying that in theory he opposes government regulation, he approves of the way that the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act now regulate loggers. To illustrate, he recounted that when his father logged in the 1950s and 60s, if the crew came across a rattlesnake, which is endangered in Ohio, they'd kill it. He prefers to live and let live. Clear cutting may look bad, the logger argued, but it's a sustainable harvesting practice and is necessary to maintaining a healthy oak hickory dominated forest. He described in detail the loggers' strategies to prevent stream siltification and soil erosion during their operations. Incidentally, the 2021 Spring Friends newsletter contains an article by another local logger and lifetime member of the Friends, also explaining these practices. Local loggers aren't against the growing number of nature preserves that are popping up in the area. However, the Otway logger I spoke with resented the stereotypes that he believes outsiders hold about his profession.
One misconception is that loggers a lot of times are perceived as just barbarians that are out here and with no education, and I do have a bachelor's degree from a high Christian university, and I don't know of any dumb loggers. If they make it in the logging business, they got to be a pretty good businessman. They got to be able to manage people. They got to be able to manage their money, and they got to be have a good maintenance program of some type if they're able to sustain the logging lifestyle, because it requires all those things.
We can lament the effects of clear cutting on the landscape and still respect that individual loggers are doing their best to tend to the forest and watershed. I turn now to consider one final story in watershed stewardship, the Otway Public Sewer Project, that offers an interesting contrast to the Friends' approach to protecting the stream. When we think about it, the idea of doing cleanups and doing education is not really attending to issues related to water quality, whereas working on the septics does do that. But there's a twist here, as I'll describe. Denise Rose, the mayor, had big plans for sprucing up the town when she began to serve on the village council and subsequently ran unopposed for mayor. She needed to get the road fixed, she wanted a cell tower, and she needed to demolish the old asbestos-filled, flood-damaged school so the village council could better take advantage of the still structurally sound gym. The problem was how to pay for it. When a man from Hunt Engineering showed up at a council meeting in 2015 with a proposal to put in a public wastewater treatment system and get a grant from the EPA to cover the installation, she was immediately on board. Others in the town were not so happy with the plan because, in their view, their private systems were working just fine and they didn't want an additional monthly bill to worry about. Seeing a win for the creek, Martin and Jody showed up to support Mayor Rose.
Yeah, it's really kind of weird, that, I've known Marty and Jody for years. I used to work up by where they lived, and but I never knew that they were into all this other stuff, with the watershed and all that. But it just and they were on board. They're one of our biggest supporters. They would come to the meetings and tell the people, this is a good thing. This is a very good thing, So they've always been there to support us, which helped.
Ultimately, of the 67 households in Otway, only 7 declined to hook into the public sewer system. When I met the engineer, he was clearly on a mission. 80 poor municipalities across the state don't have public sewage systems, and he has committed himself to rectifying that. He took me over to see the open sewage drainage pipes on Rocky Fork Stream, a small tributary that runs through Otway and right into Scioto Brush Creek. Clearly, the existing setup was environmentally hazardous to young swimmers as well as aquatic species. But the engineer had an economic argument for installing a public system as well. Because the standard lots in old towns like Otway aren't big enough to provide proper drainage for private septic systems, anyone trying to buy property can't get a mortgage. Businesses can't move in. The engineer argued if you want to avoid blight on Main Street, you need to address the waste infrastructure problem. Otway was the last small village to receive a grant before the EPA redirected its program to larger municipalities. When I returned a year and a half later to find out how things were going, the reason for the EPA's switch in focus became clear. The cost of running a public sewage system remains constant and must be divided among the existing households. The Otway public sewer was costing more than had been projected, exacting an unanticipated financial burden on already struggling families. Martin shook his head when he told me about it, but he repeated it had been absolutely the right thing to do for water quality. I didn't notice any new businesses opening up along Main Street. Perhaps a few other things had to fall in place in the cash-strapped village before the sewer could become the engine of economic recovery. The slow activism of Friends of Scioto Brush Creek provides a model for the Ohio Field School, an outsider research group working to understand communities that have been historically misunderstood and misrepresented. The Friends look for places where interests overlap. They ask permission to organize a creek day or build a trail, and they show up when the local mayor needs someone to speak for nature. At the same time, they weave together stories of naturalists from earlier eras who laid the foundation for their efforts. Gradually, over time, and in connection with other local groups, they have transformed the landscape in and around Otway and strengthened an incipient ethic of environmental stewardship among residents. Although Jody and Martin have expertise as naturalists and land managers, they invite others to join them under the umbrella of citizen science to actively steward the watershed together. After 5 years of irregular visiting, the Ohio Field School research team has learned a great deal about how one can create positive change in rural communities that are used to being overlooked, disparaged, and blamed for the problems they face. Now that I have made special treks to Scioto County to catch the snow trillium and the golden star lily in bloom, I am beginning to see the landscape as my friends and collaborators see it. I am much more aware of the way nature in western Scioto County is changing, of how and why property is changing or not changing hands. Far from being emptied out, the rural appears teeming with all kinds of life and possibility. Folklorist Jim Leary has recently argued that public folklore works this way too. Though the fieldwork may be, quote, shallow in the short run, end quote, over time one's understanding of the histories, traditions, and future designs of myriad groups occupying a particular territory deepens and broadens. Indeed, Leary argues for an open-ended, inductive approach. He says, we need to do fieldwork with a lot of individuals and cultural groups over extended periods in particular places. Listen deeply to what they have to say. Share our findings with them. Learn as much as we can about historical forces bearing upon their lives and traditional practices, and ponder the meanings with comparativist circumspection. As citizen folklorists, we at the Ohio Field School think of ourselves as cultivators of conversations, not only between ourselves and local actors, but among local actors who do not usually address each other. Our long-term, if somewhat intermittent commitment allows us to follow the emergent, unfolding aspects of community life. The drawbacks of this approach, of course, is that our developing archival collection is less focused than it might be if we had begun our project with a specific research problem in mind. Drive just a few hours north of Scioto County, and the projects of its people to transform their environments become virtually invisible. This is where the outsider ethnographer might have an additional role to play by spreading an awareness not only of what lies beneath the rocks of Scioto Brush Creek, but also of those who would protect the abundant biodiversity of which few outside the region are aware. Moreover, we can pass along the lessons we've learned over the past 5 years, encouraging our conversation partners to share what they know about their own landscapes, their own patches of nature, and how they came to be as they are. Thinking like a watershed means recognizing that people of diverse perspectives may have overlapping areas of interest that allow them to collaboratively and cooperatively make an environment we may all one day want to live in. It doesn't solve climate change or prevent the next flood.
Still, something is accomplished.
Thank you, Katie, for your wonderful keynote address, which took us to the landscapes of beautiful rural Ohio and introduced us local aspects to environmental issues of the area. Before we go to the audience questions, I will take a chance to ask you 2 questions that are related. Over the past few years, the concepts of slow activism and slow science have appeared in the titles of scientific books and presentations, and in multidisciplinary scholarly discussion. In addition, many fields, such as environmental and indigenous studies, emphasize the aspect of citizen science. We as ethnographers have always depended on engagements with people on the field and have familiarized ourselves with their ways of understanding the world. So, why is there a new need and call for these approaches? Slow activism, slow science, citizen science, and citizen folklore, particularly now in the 2020.
So apparently I'm unable to start my video, but I can certainly try to respond to that very thoughtful question. Oh, wait. Here we go. There I am. Yeah, so I think there are a number of things going on. First of all, as I was considering, after my talk, what I was trying to say, I realized that actually a lot of activism is very slow. So if we think about, for example, Gandhi's campaign to liberate India from colonialism, that took 50 years, half a century? And so when we think about activism, we tend to think of this as something that's, immediate and calling for change. But in the actual practice, if we really think about it, it's people who are in it for the long haul that can really make the structural transformation that we're all calling for. In terms of why this has become an issue in science, particularly, and in our sort of cultural sphere more generally, I think partly this is a consequence of the way in which life seems to have been speeding up over the last century, but certainly in the last 30 years, right? Things are changing very rapidly. And there is a way in which universities are organized to address big problems and create solutions on a very short time frame. And one of the things that we have discovered with that kind of paradigm is that often there isn't enough time to really consider the cultural dimensions of a problem. the political aspects of what we are trying to solve, right? So technical solutions don't actually work unless you have a kind of larger contextual understanding of the phenomena you're looking at. So I think it's partly that that there's a way in which the expectations of grantors, the expectations of universities are requiring a kind of speeded up research process. And so this idea of slowing down is, I think, a reaction to that. But you're absolutely right. The ethnographer has always understood that to really understand and respectfully represent any group of people, you need to hang out, spend some time with them.
Yes, and I think today there was already a discussion in a former panel, just a brief, about all these demands against scholars in academia, how they should be producing and also like providing research results that are beneficial to those who fund the research. So these questions are related to how we then do our research and how we think about knowledge and the knowledge we produce. And so my second question to you would be, what do you think are kind of important issues we can learn from these people that we meet? What can we learn from their understanding and their local perspectives that helps us to rethink such issues, huge issues like environment and climate change, for example? This is a big question, but what do you think and what kinds of experiences you've had?
Yes, well, I think, okay, so as I ended the talk with this comment that this kind of work does not stop climate change, right? So it seems to me that we have to be working on many fronts and recognizing that people who are trying to keep a stream clean, for example, are not going to attract the same kind of attention as people who are trying to introduce big technical solutions to already heavily polluted areas, right? So they don't have the same kinds of budgets. They don't have the same kinds of attention. They can't marshal the same teams of people to be working on these issues. And yet you can see, I think they're very eloquent in the way that they make their case. And so I would say one of the things that I have personally taken from this experience of rural Southern Ohio people is recognizing the environment, the natural environment in my own place, right? So recognizing again that nature exists pretty much everywhere and it's all important, right? So they can make a special argument about the rareness of much of their landscape, right? The rarity, because it has, just serendipitously been protected and overlooked, right? But I think that we have to make that same argument for wherever we are, right? Because it's about connecting with nature. It's about being in nature. It's about being knowledgeable about your landscape, right? You can't understand what its value is if you don't know it, And so I think that's part of the message that I think that they would like for me to broadcast more widely.
Erika, now we have 2 questions from the attendees. Could we just take them and then we can continue,
Yes.
or you can continue? Okay, first, Caroline Contentin is first saying that thanks for your inspiring presentation that is giving voice to slow, maybe not spectacular activism. And then the question is, what is citizen science practically changing for an ethnography then? Is it a matter of institutional recognition, more financial support?
Yes. So let me back up a little bit and talk about citizen science. So often, I personally think, having gotten into this work through the Ohio Field School Project, I have been extremely impressed by the way that scientists, and particularly naturalists, environmentalists, have been able to marshal volunteer support. So, for instance, when someone raises money all through donations to make a preserve, and then they have the responsibility of managing that preserve, they need people to come and mow and put the trails in because they don't have staff, right? And they seem to have become very adept at just getting ordinary citizens to help with those kinds of projects. And I think folklore could learn from that. How do we understand our projects as having a role for volunteers? Or, I mean, what does it mean that we have official folklorists and then we have other people who are the folk? So I think the citizen science model helps us to kind of just erase a little bit that divide between the person who is the researcher and the person who is the researched, right? By bringing in that idea that we can all do science or we can all do ethnology together, right? So that's maybe the way I would answer that. And the other thing is just looking at the way in which the arguments people are making for preserving certain areas are based on this 100 years of collecting and observing and all of that kind of thing. And I know in Helsinki, you, of course, have an archive of folk knowledge that might be similar to the Museum of Biological Diversity, right? But I think that that is something to consider as a really valuable resource that can help you make arguments in the present. I don't know if we're doing that as much in folklore and ethnography, making arguments for things based on the collections that we have made in the past. But perhaps some of my Finnish colleagues could speak better to how the archives are being used in the present.
Thank you, Katie. A technical detail for the attendees, you can also use the raise hand functionality, and then we or the Nomad IT can switch your mic on. You cannot do it yourself. But there are 2 more questions, actually 3 more questions that I will read aloud in the questions and answers. You can also put your questions there. So Ida Hughes Tidlund asks or says, thank you for a terrific presentation. I have a question that is crucial to researchers in many European countries. With the general data protection regulations of the European Union, researchers are no longer allowed to collect any data consisting any sensitive information without having the project vetted in advance. Researchers are also often restricted to stay to pre-planned questions to ask when in field. How do those rules align with the ideal and need of slow science you think?
Yes, well, I think that they would certainly make the kind of project that we're doing at Ohio Field School difficult because we do we do identify the people that we work with by name. We do share all our materials with local archival repositories, so all the material is public. We did have an international review board application that we had to do before we started the work. So that's still, that we do have that regulation, but I am becoming more and more aware of the way in which ethnography doesn't really fit the anonymous social science setting up you can't do inductive research if you already have your hypothesis, right? You can't go and find out what the research question should be if you have to have it ahead of time. So I do think that sounds like it's going to make things very difficult. But again, I would defer to my European colleagues who maybe have found workarounds to this kind of an issue.
And then the next question is from Susie Thomas. Thank you for a wonderful opening keynote. In light of this fascinating case study and the connections that seem to be developing between the local activists and researchers, what does the idea of participatory research mean to you?
Yes. Well, yes. So this is, I think, a soft form of participatory action research. We have worked very hard to develop ongoing relationships with a whole host of community partners. So Martin and Jody are the two who I featured in this presentation, but we have, I think, close to 30 of Southeast Ohio. And participatory action research is usually focused on addressing a community need or a community desire. And so the researchers work with community partners to make the research practically contribute to addressing that need. In our case, we started with a possibility of doing work with communities. We didn't have a community coming to us and saying, we need you to do such and such research, right? That's the ideal for participatory action research, that the community declares the need and the researchers come in and work with them. So we had to kind of go out and find our partners. And now we are in a situation where we have a number of partners and we can work then as the communities develop their own agendas, we can find ways to support that work. And what we say that we offer is documentation, right? And particularly documentation of small groups who are doing activist work in rural environments who don't have the time to document their own practices, who don't necessarily have their records in order. So that's kind of one of the ways that we are doing participatory research more broadly with these other partners, is helping to document their own work. Because as ethnographers, that's what we feel we can offer.
Thank you. I have the privilege of being the voice of all the attendees. This is such a privilege. Anyway, the next question is from Molly Andrews, one of our key performers in this conference. Hello, Molly. Molly says, very rich paper, thank you. Can you say more about how you understand activism?
Yes, well, I think that my personal performance of activism tends to be going to the demonstration and rallying for justice, right? So there's all those kind of, sort of stereotypical ideas of activism. And I am becoming convinced that there are many, many ways to make change, and particularly in rural conservative communities. My brand of, activism isn't all that effective. And so thinking about the ways to find common ground with people, recognize how we draw people into projects without requiring them to be card-carrying members of any particular persuasion, right? So that is what this current slow activism case is about, and of course, it reflects the particular kinds of communities that we're trying to work with, right? So, in other contexts, you might use a different approach because the community's way of acting is different. So I think there are many, many ways to do activist research and to do activism itself. But what I'm proposing, I think, is that we look beyond the moments of contestation, right? The moments of clash, the moments in which people are openly disagreeing, to find other forms of activism as well. Not that we don't honor and respect those more contestatory kinds of activism, but that we broaden our field of understanding of the umbrella of activist research.
Okay, and then Nicolas Labigre is asking and telling us that thank you for this wonderful talk. It's so good to hear the voices of those you have worked with. How have your contributors responded to your academic analysis, talks like this one, of their everyday lives and this long-running local environmental group?
Right. Yeah. So this is always the question. So if we are really doing this collaborative process, then we want our local actors to be part of all the stages of the process. But of course, there are practical limitations to that. So for instance, in the Ohio Field School, what we do minimally is we return all the documentation to repositories in the community. Nothing goes into the record that we have created for people that individual people have not had a chance to vet. So if I did an interview with someone, I would send them a copy of the interview, and they would let us know that yes, they would like it to be public, or no, they would like something changed or something deleted, or they want to do the interview over again. So that's kind of the way in which, the people, the students interviewed, for example, remain sort of part of that process. But it would be unrealistic for me to send this presentation, for example, or a paper I wrote, to all of those people. So what I did in this case was I contacted Martin and Jody and sent them a draft. Now, what I presented is not that draft, but they had a chance to weigh in. Of course, you all know that in the academic process, I send something out to be published, it comes back with all sorts of suggestions, and then it goes out and comes back again. And really, community partners are not going to be available to vet every single iteration. But Martin and Jody were the first readers, so they were able to weigh in. They were able to make any kind of corrections that they felt they needed to make, or comment. And I can say that they did like the presentation in the form that they received it. So yeah, but that's a very tricky issue. Like, how much can you really expect your community collaborators to be involved in this sort of academic end of things post the fieldwork experience? So we do our best, right? That's the bottom line, is we find ways to make sure that we're representing them in ways that they approve of.
Okay, thank you. Now I will take the opportunity and ask one question. And remember that you can also use the raise hand functionality. I would like you to elaborate a bit on the very powerful metaphor of watershed. It's obviously not only a metaphor, it's a really concrete thing in this particular case, but thinking like a watershed is obviously a metaphor. The way I see it is that it actually has two sides, two quite ambiguous sides. The one is pooling together things, like pooling together the water from all the water sources into one vast reservoir. The other is that it divides the waters so that they flow into different directions. Are these both aspects of being or thinking like a watershed present also in this particular case?
Yes. So I was thinking, actually, in an earlier iteration, Erica knows this, I did kind of talk about the metaphor a little bit more than in this presentation. So when we think, particularly in a cultural context, when we think of a watershed moment, it's like everything coming up to the peak is one thing, and then there is a change, and you go down the other direction into a whole new universe of possibility, right? And that is not actually the aspect of the metaphor that I've been working with here. It's much more about, this idea that small local collaborations can contribute eventually to larger and larger formations. So, yeah.
So it's this pooling together.
Yes. The efforts from many different areas all coming together into one big stream. And that is happening a lot in Scioto County, interestingly enough, not only with the concerns for nature, but as some of you may know, that this was a kind of epicenter of the opioid epidemic. So there's a lot of really wonderful work in recovery going on there. And there are increasing connections between people who are living in the rural areas and people who are living in the town. It's a very interesting and vibrant place. But again, particularly in a place like Ohio, if you go to a rural area as an outsider, it's very hard to see where the activity and where the life is, because you can't see it from the road, right? You really have to stop. You have to talk to people. You have to go in the gas station, right? Because it's not very outward facing.
Thanks. We can still hear the birds singing in the background. Yeah, Erika, please go.
That's beautiful. If nobody else has any question, I would have a last one that is related to what you just described about how it's not too easy to go and find the activism or the people in the countryside and so on. I know, and I've enjoyed your pedagogy too. So what would you say to students who go and do and learn how to do field work and who are learning how to engage with people in the remote areas or in the cities, wherever? Mm-hmm. What would be your advice on how to catch and hear these local perspectives, how to find them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think I would answer this in a couple of different ways. So one of the things that I did not mention about the Ohio Field School, but which I think is a quite important aspect of our model, is that because ethnography requires you to go into areas where you may not, you may be talking to strangers, right? You may be talking with people who are very different from you. We have set up our methodology so that people go in pairs. And it's, partly for protection, but really more for that sort of, how do you get over the nervousness of knocking on someone's door, for example, right? And you don't know who's on the other side of the door. Well, if you have someone with you, it makes that quite a bit easier. So I would encourage young scholars to think about, who are my partners? Who might I collaborate with so that I can actually get myself out into the world that is different from my world, and do it in a way that's not so nerve-wracking. And then the other thing I would say is that field work is a process of discovery. And so remembering that you might have to, make several visits to a place before you find the people that you're really looking for, right? You have to kind of go through layers of contacts. If you're going to do, this really in-depth, slow, emerging over time kind of work. So to just pay attention to your schedule. Don't think that your first visit is going to be the one that gets you what you're looking for, that you maybe have to go and hang out for quite a while until you find the people or you find the situations that work in terms of discovery. So, yeah. And the other aspect of that is to not feel like you've wasted your time because you went somewhere and spent hours listening to people talking and it didn't surface what you were looking for, right? Because it's all part of the process of building those relationships and creating and getting that contextual understanding of this environment that you're moving into as an ethnographer, right? That you're trying to learn about, even if it's an environment that right? Even if you are also a member of the group, when you become an ethnographer, you have to kind of take on that idea of being a learner, a questioner, trying to get perspectives that are different from the ones you already have.
Thank you. And now we have two more questions. The first is from Laura Puolamäki. Thank you very much for this inspiring presentation. Citizen activism related to nature is often described as environmental activism or stewardship, but it seems that our cultural relationship with the landscape and nature actually triggers these activities and joint stewardships. actions. What would be your advice to us in communicating cultural sustainability in environmental debate like water protection?
Yes. So there is a great deal of research that looks at environmental efforts, particularly on the policy level, that actually contribute to that become a threat to cultural sustainability. So if we think about sort of fishing regulations or there are many cases in which what is good for the environment, for example, the sewer project, is not for people. Not a win-win. And so I think we want to always be keeping that in mind. And I think one of the things that impressed me so much about Martin and Jody's work is they knew that and they were trying to avoid that, right? They weren't addressing the water quality issue as the most important issue because the water quality of the creek is still pretty good, right? Instead, they were looking for ways to get to that cultural and local affective relationship with nature, right? And support that and encourage that in kids, for example. So yeah, I think that cultural sustainability it's important to try to find the ways that environmental and cultural sustainability can work together and not be in opposition to one another.
Okay. And then Tiina Suopajärvi is saying, thank you for your beautiful keynote. Do you think you being in the field has had an impact on local power relations? And if so, how? What do you think of this side of ethnography? How should we reflect that? What should we do with it?
Yes, I would say that I have not very much influence in Scioto County or Perry County where we have been doing work. But that is certainly an issue with field work, particularly when you take on the role of representing a community, representing a group that needs representation. And so in that respect, I think I would say the Ohio Field School has been very careful about avoiding the representation, the politics and the power of representation, and really focusing more on becoming a partner, working with people, developing our own relationships, and also developing relationships among various actors in the local field who weren't necessarily in conversation before we started our project. I think that the issue with this issue of the ethnographer is holding the power really has to do with, again, that representing through writing or through documenting. And it is something we need to really be thoughtful about, particularly when we're working with groups that have been marginalized and misrepresented in the past. So our response has been to try not to represent, to try to make the local, to provide platforms for the local actors to represent themselves. Yeah.
Thinking of the local power relations, isn't it possible that these people you have been in partnership with, they have felt empowered by your presence and by the presence of this academic sort of a gaze?
Yes, well, yes, I would say that that might be the case. I don't think it's quite the case in this case, but I do think one of the things that we have found in both counties that we've been working in, that people have really, really appreciated our interest because they largely feel invisible outside of the local sphere. And so when you have a group of people who are coming in and learning from them, and they really have expressed over and over how much they appreciate the fact that we come and participate with them, and are interested in their problems and their successes. So it's not so much people feeling empowered as feeling seen, perhaps. I would say it's more on that level. Seen and heard.
Thank you. And then a question from Katarina Siivonen. Thank you for the inspiring talk and discussion. To continue the discussion about cultural sustainability, could you give your definition of the term?
Cultural sustainability. Okay, so this would be my definition off the top of my head would be people having the ability to determine their way of living and their futures, right? That groups of people can make a future for themselves, and that would be in the way that they see is most appropriate. So I don't think it's about museumifying communities. It's about keeping the ability to transform the environment in the local sphere. That is what's most important.
Thank you. And our time is up. Thank you so much, Katie. Thank you, Erika. Thank you, all the attendees, especially those who asked the question. And it's time to go to listen to some music. It will not happen here in this very same webinar place. It will. You will need to exit this Zoom and webinar and go to Vuva, and you will find in the agenda. You will find the slot where you can click into the musical program. And I will remember from this session the bird singing from Katie's background. And also the fact that when I came to my workplace here in Topelia, you can see in the background the gate to the street. This is a very serene, calm academic environment. But when you open that gate, there's a roadblock. There's a demonstration going on. The environmentalist group called Elokapina Biosphere Rebellion has blocked the road, built some tents, and they are singing and dancing there. So activism is all around us. It's either fast or slow, but it's there if you just look behind you. Thank you, Katie. And now let's go and enjoy the music.
So, hello everyone. My name is Ulla Savolainen and I will be moderating this session. Just to let you know, we are recording this session. Next, we will hear a welcome address of the Kalevala Society by Dr. Niina Hämäläinen, the Executive Director of the Kalevala Society. Please, Niina, the screen is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. On behalf of the Kalevala Society and its board, I warmly welcome you all to the 15th Congress of SIEF in beautiful virtual Helsinki. My name is Niina Hämäläinen and I'm an Executive Director of the Kalevala Society. First, I want to thank Vice Rector and Professor Hanna Snellman and the local organizing committee by the University of Helsinki for inviting the Kalevala Society to be a part of the Congress. The Kalevala Society promotes, funds and publishes research and art relating to the Kalevala and cultural heritage. Besides, as of January 2021, the Society publishes international monograph series in the research fields of SIEF, Folklore Fellows Communications. This gives the Kalevala Society a wonderful opportunity to strengthen our international communication with you. A contribution of the Kalevala Society at SIEF 2021 is to offer you the social program. Social program is give an artistic curve with a strong Finnish twist to the scientific event. Artists will show you something traditional and modern, conventional and underground, not to mention the party vibe. There are two traditional performances with modern tone, rune singing by Iki Turso and Joix by Angelit, which both are very beautiful and powerful in their singing. They give you a real chill. Then you have a chance, actually after this talk, to listen to and maybe take some dance steps. 5-string fiddle duo that brings folk fiddle tunes back into the light of day. Enjoy the great energy of the duo Lajunen and Oskala. Combining singing and while dancing with accordions and synthesizers, Suistamon Sähkö will give you surprising vibes. This band you would like to invite to your backyard and get a summer feast started. As every Congress has a banquet followed by closing party, so it will be this time as well. On Thursday night, I invite you all to join virtual crazy dance with the others to the cool beat of DJ sound. All these performances of the social program can break the rules. Just let yourself go with the flow. I hope you enjoy the artistic flavor of the Congress. And I wish you all a great week with wonderful discussions, panels and papers. Thank you.
Thank you, Niina. So, as Niina mentioned, next we have the pleasure to hear music by duo Emilia Lajunen and Suvi Oskala. Please, the screen is yours.
Hello, we are duo Emilia Lajunen and Suvi Oskala, and we play 5-string fiddles. All tunes what you will heard today are Finnish traditional tunes. And we have dug those tunes into archives. The first tune what we played was Polska from Ostopotnia, arranged for us by Pia Kleemola. And the next tune after that was Oskarin Valssi. And I found that when I was researching in the archives.
And we'll now continue with 2 other tunes. The first one is Mazurka from Eura, which is in the western parts of Finland. It's called Sipin Mazurka. And last but not least, we'll play you some Finnish polka. And we hope that in spite of the distance, you've enjoyed your conference and our music today.
Thank you, duo Emilia Lajunen and Suvi Oskala. I want to thank all the attendees for participating in this opening ceremony. Next, if you want to chat and get to know with other conference participants and perhaps have a drink together, please go back to Huva, where you can join several informal meetings. And these meetings have very interesting, but not in any ways restrictive themes. I wish you all a nice evening and a very inspiring SIEF 2021 Congress.